Good evening. Well, we're starting on an Art Center time as usual, 15 minutes late, but that's who we are. Welcome to all of our guests and panelists, Art Center students, faculty, staff, trustees, alumni, both who are here in the Amundsen Auditorium tonight, and those of us that are joining online as well. We have quite an audience online, actually all over the world for this. Thank you for joining us in this celebration of artist and activist Keith Haring. I'm Karen Hofmann. I am the president here at ArtCenter College of Design, and it's my privilege to be welcoming you all here tonight for a very special conversation with some folks that have some serious relationships with Keith Haring and those that have certainly been inspired by him. So we'll have some discussion for a little bit, and then we'll get into some Q&A with you all. So if you do have questions, please keep them tucked for a little bit later. So we're excited to present this conversation about the only mural in Los Angeles that is Keith Haring's mural and his legacy for social change. It's a very special evening for our community because, in particular, we have quite a few alumni that are here tonight and faculty and staff that are here tonight and online that were here in 1989 when Keith painted that mural right above our heads that you've seen when you came down the stairwell. Not only that, but Keith spent a couple days here really sharing his ideas and his experiences and his perspective with our community. For those of you who are not familiar with ArtCenter College of Design, welcome to our Hillside campus. This is the home to our industrial design disciplines, as well as film and photography and imaging. We have another campus in downtown Pasadena, which is our home to art, illustration, communication design, and media design programs, as well as our Art Center extension. We're 93 years old, and in these 93 years, we've delivered a professional, industry-focused art and design education with now alumni that are out in the world doing amazing things. The best way to understand who we are is to see the work. So if you do have a chance after the panel discussion tonight, please go upstairs and see our student gallery on the, I think that's the east side. Yes, east side of the campus. You'll see signs for that as well. It's important to acknowledge that ArtCenter College of Design is included in the region of the ancestral and traditional lands of the Cajamarca Tongva people, who historically inhabited the San Gabriel Valley area around present-day Pasadena and Altadena. We honor their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, and learn on their traditional homeland. So there are a few significant moments that are bringing us all here together tonight. First, there is an incredible show at the Broad, the Keith Haring Art is for Everybody exhibition. And here is the catalog, and you will hear from Sarah a little bit later about the curation of this. And it is the first museum survey of Keith Haring in Los Angeles, and it just opened up at the end of May, runs through October 8th. If you have not seen it, go see it. It's an incredible show. And something else kind of special, our own Tracy Schiffman, who is on faculty here, is the designer of this beautiful catalog. So, again, Sarah Loyer will tell us more about the curation aspect. Another piece that brings us together here is the music. As you're walking in the auditorium, and I certainly loved the music that we got to preview, is one of Keith Haring's many mixtapes. So that was a privilege to actually start our evening with the music that he mixed. Thank you to the Keith Haring Foundation for that soundtrack. Music was a huge influence on Keith's work, and for some of us that did grow up in the 80s, we know how important hip hop is. He worked with many artists like Fab Five Freddy, Queen Latifah, Chuck D, and Public Enemy. Many of his inspirations and drawings reflect that culture of hip hop, and it happens to be the 50th anniversary of hip hop as well this year. And the third thing, it's June, it's Pride Month. And as we recognize and celebrate our LGBTQ plus community, it's an honor for ArtCenter to be hosting this conversation about an openly gay artist who committed his short life of 31 years to making this world better. It's an honor. In 1989, Keith Haring was invited to paint a mural here at ArtCenter in honor of the second annual World AIDS Day. a designated a national day of action and mourning in response to the AIDS crisis, and as part of the first ever Day Without Art. So there was an invitation. I'm going to read what the invitation said to the community to invite them to this special moment. To mark this occasion, ArtCenter is sponsoring a 3-day visit to the campus by artist Keith Haring. On November 29th and 30th, he will paint a mural adjacent to the library, beginning each day at about noon. And I'm guessing it was around noon. The mural will be a permanent memorial to members of the art community who have died of AIDS, and will also serve as a symbol of hope and compassion for those whose lives have been touched by the epidemic. And here we are, 35 years later, this large-scale installation with its playful colors and evocative imagery remains perfectly in sync with all that we value as an institution by celebrating art's transcendent power to change the world. For many of us, the mural serves as a portal back in time, not only for those of us that were fortunate enough to be here when Keith was here, but for many of us who are inspired every day as we walk by his work. It is a beacon, a reminder of how important the role of artists are in our world, and how important it is to be brave, to be bold, and be our authentic selves. Keith's work has had and continues to have a profound impact and creative influence on our community throughout the decades. So before I introduce our amazing panelists, I'm thrilled to share a short film created by our digital content and media group that captures Keith's time here at ArtCenter. When our team heard the radio audio, or the rare audio of the conversation that Keith had with students when he was here after painting the mural in 1989, we knew that our current students and our community now needed to hear these words. This 5-minute film, which features gorgeous footage from alumnus Hadi Salehi, includes only a small excerpt of that precious audio from the 2 hours of insight and inspiration that Keith shared with our ArtCenter students back in 1989. So let's play that film. Thank you.
Can you hear all right? Or do I have to lean forward more? All right. I have a real hard time talking about what pieces are about, because in a way, because of the way they're made, they just sort of, they happen little by little. And when I agreed to come here, I was coming to do a lecture and to do a mural, and the mural was not specifically having to do with anything. When you do a mural, it has to fit into the context, how long it's going to be there, who's going to see it, things like that. If I was going to do a specific AIDS mural, it would be an educational thing. And I wouldn't do it inside an art school, I'd do it on a public wall. But then, I don't know, I think it ended up having something to do with it anyway, because there was some sort of images of sort of suffering and restraint, but then there's a positive thing of the fish turning into birds and things too. So I don't know. I mean, I can't say specific things. I mean, it's because the things, I mean, all the things really were more about evoking ideas and images from other people than about saying a specific thing, you know. Especially when I was drawing the subway. And a lot of things, like, especially when I was drawing the subway, I didn't know what, a lot of them, I mean, I would create on the spot, and I didn't know what they meant when I did it. And I'd find out more from things people would tell me later than, you know, that I didn't even realize what I had done. I was like, oh yeah, that's what it means, you know. So it's, you know, people in the subway, always the very first thing that would come out of their mouth, no matter who it was what does it mean? You know, because it appeared, unlike the advertisements which surrounded it, which were telling you exactly and trying to tell you what they meant. The drawings were sort of asking you something or making you figure out what, but everyone that looked at them assumed that it meant something because it seemed symbolic. And my answer was always just that whatever they thought it meant was the right thing. And then they'd go off and they'd tell me these stories and their interpretations, and it would be much better than what I could have told them anyway. Yeah. The way that, from the beginning, when I started doing the figures and things that were about communication, about communicating ideas, and then finding an outlet, and finding this huge network of people, and realizing that through television and magazines and all these things that you were reaching all these people, that I started realizing the responsibility that carried with it. I mean, if you're communicating to hundreds of thousands of people every day, you have to think about what it is that you're saying. And the work was sort of just because it was instantly accessible and because it could communicate really easy, it was completely sort of made for that kind of thing. So, I mean, I didn't really feel like I had a choice one way or another. It was just the obvious thing that I had to use it for a positive thing. Every time when I go someplace, I'll find a place that I can do a mural at the same time so that there's something left there. This is actually the first mural I have in the LA area. So I mean, I wanted to make a mural that would be something that could be looked at for a long time. Because this mural should be here for a long time, and age shouldn't be. I think that's the last slide.
Wow. I want to thank our team, especially Lauren Mahoney and Christine Spines, and everybody who poured a lot into this. It was, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago, I think we were having a meeting, and I said, well, what if we did this thing and we put together the audio with a piece, and then all of a sudden they were on their way and they made it happen. And so this is a story that needs to be told, a story we're really quite proud of, and one that's at the beginning, and we know we're just going to build upon this incredible narrative now and this really important part of our history. So at this time, I'll ask our panelists to come on up and have a seat and get cozy. And once you're seated, I'll do some introductions here. And I think our microphones are live, right? We'll figure it out as we go. Great, so I'm going to start at the far end here. It is an honor to introduce Keith's youngest sister, Kristen Haring, and we're thrilled to have you here, Kristen. She's a trustee on the foundation, on the Keith Haring Foundation since 1989. She is also a cultural historian with a focus on technology's relationship to identity and design. She engages students and professionals alike through interactive workshops that illuminate the intricate connections between people in the past. So, Kristen, you're going to come back again another time and run one of those workshops. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. Next is Gil Vasquez, who was just 17 years old when he became friends with Keith Haring. Today, Gil is the executive director and president of the Keith Haring Foundation. The mission of the foundation is to sustain, expand, and protect the legacy of Keith Haring and his art and his ideals. The foundation supports nonprofit organizations that assist children as well as organizations involved in education, prevention, and care related to AIDS. Next, we have Danny Brown is a contemporary painter, muralist, teacher, and ArtCenter alumnus. The subculture of street art and encouragement through school programs led him to pursue his personal creative practice as a career. He combines art history, California subculture, and his indigenous roots to create his signature style. He has exhibited in galleries in Los Angeles and New York. And Danny, it's really great to have you back. Next, we have Patrick Ruby. Patrick is an art director at the Los Angeles Times. You may have seen his work recently. He is a native Angelino who graduated from ArtCenter College of Design, where he earned a bachelor's degree in illustration and design. His passions include the LGBTQ+ community and advocating for mental health. His work has been recognized by American Illustrator, Communication Arts, and Wallpaper Magazine. And next up is Aaron Smith, an artist, ArtCenter alumnus, and associate chair of ArtCenter's illustration department. Aaron was one of the students who watched Keith paint the mural on campus in 1989. After living in New York for several years, and we know there's lots of stories about that, Aaron moved back to Los Angeles and became part of the underground club and art scenes. Aaron's art has been featured in solo exhibitions in galleries in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, and in group shows at galleries and museums nationwide. And I'm extremely happy to welcome Sarah Lawyer here. Sarah is the curator and exhibitions manager at the Broad. She is the curator of Keith Haring, Art is for Everybody. Again, the first museum exhibition of the artist's work here in Los Angeles. Laura also edited this exhibition catalog, which I held up before and I'll hold up again because it's incredible. And which includes new scholarship and reflections from many of Haring's contemporaries, and it is a heck of an overview. So thank you, panelists. I'm going to transition over here to my seat, and we're going to start a little bit of our Q&A. Okay, so thanks again for being here tonight. It is really one of the things when we were talking last week together, I did not know that Kristen, Gil, and Sarah, you had not seen the mural in person before. So I want to start, you know him so well. What are your thoughts about the mural? And what do you see that might be different or might be consistent in his work?
Well, one thing I want to say is thank you so much for making the film, because what I would like to draw people's attention to is how the mural was made. If you watch the film again, you'll see that the black foregrounded image was done last. So in some of Keith's other works, it really looks like he drew a black outline and then colored it in. And that's rarely how he worked. So you saw in the film that the large blocks of color, what might have been the more abstract representations of that red monster, for instance, who's wearing the crown on the left, that image was done first. And before the black lines that you might say are outlining parts of him. Keith did not work by creating a sketch first, neither on a piece of paper nor on the canvas or wall on which he was painting. So he had the whole image in his head. And that's something that I always like to draw people's attention to, especially when they have the privilege of seeing his work in person. When you see the scale, when you see the brush strokes, to see that all of this complexity was somehow in his head at once, and he broke down the layers of it and produced them in that fashion.
I think the thing that comes to mind for me, obviously it's a beautiful mural. The thing that comes to mind for me is the context in which he is asked to do this mural. He's obviously aware that he is sick. The article in Rolling Stone had recently come out, where he basically says that he is sick, and he kind of proclaims that to the public for the first time. And he's quite sensitive to wanting to be, he at that point did not want to be interviewed. It was my understanding that when he came to do the mural, he was happy that, maybe press would be invited to watch him paint the mural, but he was not really interested in answering any questions about it. He was quite sensitive, did not really want to speak or, speak further about what he had just shared with the world. You hear the audio where he says, he did not want this to be an AIDS mural, did not want this to be about AIDS. But in some fashion, it sort of ends up being about it anyway. To me, the example of that is what Kristen pointed out earlier, is the dolphins that are becoming birds, and one is caught and sort of, its life is truncated before it gets to become a bird and before it gets to soar. So that's the thing that jumps out to me.
Yeah, I think that's really important context to also think about. He made this work in November into early December 1989, and he died in February of 1990. So this is just a few months before his death at the age of 31. So putting that within the context of where he was in his life and how he was thinking about his artistic legacy as his legacy, I think is really important. Formally, I think there are a lot of works of this period toward the end of his life where he's doing this color block technique, and you can see so many images that you'll see repeated throughout his work, from the earliest work all the way on in this mural. So I think he's going back to a lot of the imagery, even some of the earliest imagery that he made before he even started making figurative works. He was working mostly in abstraction and in a kind of performative way. And I think on the very far right of the mural, you see that kind of pattern that is reminiscent of those works from the late 70s even.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives, because I don't think we've heard those perspectives before. And this, again, is a huge part of who we are as an institution. And there is somebody here, and Aaron, I'm going to pivot to you. Can you share with our audience a little bit about how the mural came about?
Yeah, well, my understanding was that Phil Hayes, our chair of illustration at the time, who was very fabulous, and he was a well-known illustrator from New York, who was our chair, and he read the article, and he reached out, and because it was almost a dare, because I think Keith said that he didn't think that any institution was going to interact with him, and so Phil took the challenge, and it was part of the Day Without Art. And I think Phil wasn't into, I think Keith Haring probably wasn't into the idea of like, well, no, there shouldn't be a day without art. It seems like that's not his way of thinking. And so we knew he was coming. Now this is before emails, and this is before anything like that. So it was just kind of a buzz. And I remember when he came, we were all waiting, and it was my final week, the last finals of my time at ArtCenter. So it was kind of momentous. And I always tell my students, thinking of this mural, like you don't, like, pay attention, because you don't know what you're witnessing sometimes. You don't know how it's going to affect you later on. But he came, and they had it's exactly as it was. There was a panel in place, and they had covered the upper landing with a scaffolding. And I remember our talk was like, how am I going to get to my final? Like, I have to go outside the building and out and around. And that was our big concern. And he came, and as I remember, and I always worry this is like a fish story, because it's been a long time. It's been 35 years. But he came, and we witnessed him being a little bit shocked, because there was a panel. And he said, I came here for a mural. and it was a little bit awkward. And it was very art center because at the time, this building was pristine. Not, we had posters up, there's announcements. This was like a museum, and it was strange for an art school. It's a magnificent building, but it was very that. And I think there was a little kerfuffle over it, and he said, I'm making this for the students. And I think he was thinking of this idea that this was going to stay, and he really wanted it to stay. And then he started in, and I was really startled by the way he painted. And I distinctly remember that the color was going down in these blocks, and I thought, that's not what I know of his work. I know the lines, but also there was this I kept thinking of, it's sort of like a monk, sort of doing, because there was kind of a rhythm to what he does, and I think there's a kind of a deliberateness of like, okay, that mark, and then that mark, and we just watched it, and then we would go back and forth to our finals, and then there were a couple faculty that were like, you can't ditch the final, and there was a little tension because people were trying to get back, and there was a crowd that just kind of hung out, and it was super celebratory, but it was, I moved to New York soon after graduation and saw the pop shop when I first was there, and he was gone by then. But his, I think, legacy was in the air. And I came out a couple of years after moving to New York, and I think I kind of held that knowledge of this was a out gay man in this environment, which was not as hospitable as it is today to queer voices. And I think that, I think the most profound thing that I took away was his steadfastness and his intention about understanding why he was doing it and who it was for. And I think that's something I've held on to since. So.
Aaron, thank you for that. And I think there is so much of a legacy that he left and the profound impact, right? So I'd like to move to the next generation. Patrick, I think you were probably here as a student 20 years after I'm trying to get my math right with your time. Yeah, just about. I remember you graduated in 2010. I remember that. Yeah. What does Keith's work, what does Keith mean to you? What does this mural mean to you? How has this influenced you as an artist?
Well, first of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. And Sarah, I saw the show this weekend, and it was incredibly moving. In fact, I'm feeling slightly emotional right now thinking about it, especially hearing, how young he was when he passed away. I think I had a similar experience, I think, to Aaron. I came out actually while I was a student here at ArtCenter, and the thing about Keith's work is it's so unapologetically gay. It doesn't get at it from an angle. It's right there. And I saw this show this weekend with my husband, and I think, like a lot of people, I had experienced Keith's work through pop culture, through T-shirts and hats and buttons and things like that. And my husband had a similar experience in realizing how political the work is, how powerful and deliberate it is with its message, and yet still so joyful. And that those two things can coexist together has really had an effect on me personally, and trying to figure out my own voice and my own identity as a queer artist. And there's just a bravery in it when you think about the time that he was working. And I think lastly, I like Keith's work formally. It's fun. But I really began to care for him as a person when I researched the mural a few years ago, and just putting myself, trying to imagine that he knew he was dying, and he still had so much work to do, and he didn't stop. And there's something incredibly powerful in that.
Indeed. Patrick, thank you for going deep there, because I share that, and again, we'll pivot to the curation of that exhibition, because I had to go take breaths outside. It was an honor being there on opening night, and I had to leave a couple times because it's an absolute joy and an absolute devastation all at once to witness that work in the scale that it's in. So emotional is indeed what you struck. Before we pivot there, I do want to tap into this generational conversation, because Danny, your work is powerful, and you are a muralist. You have a passion for public art, and the other thing that's really magnificent about your work is that theme of accessibility. Everybody gets to participate, and what is it about Keith's work that has inspired you in your young career so far?
Thank you guys for being here, first of all. When I went to this school, I didn't really have a lot of education as far as like the art thing. I just remember Keith for drawing in the subways, and I always thought that was kind of cool just because I had a similar background, just kind of like doodling around just because, it was just the thing to do growing up. And I liked how he was able to transition from that to be respected in this art and have work politically, because I know he criticized Reagan a lot, and I admire that just because of the ramifications that had happened with his policy. Kind of affected a lot of generations after him, and I think being outspoken during that time was kind of powerful. And as far as like looking at his work as well, the public art, I would just knew him as a writer, and then learning more about him, how he was very humble, he was very respected in like the hip hop scene, and wanted to put that in the forefront. And I admire that a lot, just because I've never really thought of like making art interactive, and like he spoke about it being very performative, and in public, because like usually when you paint, you have like maybe an hour or 2 hours, and you're kind of like in the outskirts, or like in this like very quiet time when like everyone's asleep. So to do that in public, and like even if you mess up, you're just gonna fix it, and then people can see the process from it, and it's very like freeing too, just because it's you're gonna fix it, and like you're gonna make a mistake, but in the end, like it's gonna turn out fine. So I always admire that from him, and like his work is iconic, just as like the Mickey Mouse characters he did. And I teach the youth in MacArthur Park right now, and a lot of them are very intimidated to draw, so they draw stick figures. And I remember showing some of my students Keith's work and how he was able to draw the anatomy, and a lot of them felt like they can accomplish that because it was very easy to replicate, and it gave them encouraging steps to pursue more difficult drawing obstacles. So for that, like I admire him for showing me a better way, and I'm able to pass that on to like the students that I teach at art.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for really integrating teaching the next generation to your career. That's exactly what we want our alumni to do. So thank you. And I think this whole theme around art is for everybody. And Sarah, I'm going to pivot to you now, because there are thousands, millions that are going to see this work, both in person, online. But could you share with us how this show materialized and what inspired the curation of the show?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So the exhibition is titled Art is for Everybody after Keith's journal entry. He wrote that in his journal at the age of 20. when he was a student at SVA in New York. And it really became a through line in his career. He wanted to make work that was accessible. He wanted to break down barriers. He really arrived in New York at a time when the art world was pretty insular, and he was pushing against that in his practice. And so even as he became a famous artist traveling the world, which happened pretty quickly, by his early mid-20s, he was traveling all around the world and having shows in Europe and Japan and elsewhere. He was still prioritizing that work, making work for publics, whether that was through murals at schools, hospitals, in other public spaces, or also doing workshops with youth at exhibitions, really prioritizing being on the ground with the people and focused on community in that way. So the show tries to kind of draw that through line, while also being, since it's the first museum scale exhibition of Haring's work in Los Angeles, I felt it was important to really show the breadth of his career. So it really spans from 1978 to 1989, just months before his passing. So showing that whole arc, even though it's just over a decade, there's still a lot of shifts that happens throughout that time. And I guess the last thing I'll say is kind of piggybacking off of some of the comments so far, is that kind of duality between joy and optimism, and really addressing social and political issues of the era is it's a hallmark of his work, and it's what he does best, I think. And the show also, you'll see that you kind of start out with really joyful, bright, day-glow works, and about halfway through, I call it a bit of a gut punch.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Transitioning into more of those thematic, addressing issues that were really central to that era, like wealth disparity, growing wealth disparity, of course the AIDS crisis, patriarchy, white supremacy, lots of issues that we continue to grapple with today, from a moment when that was really kind of the start of the culture wars that we're still living in.
Ahead of his time, and unfortunately, it is what it is still today. Gil, I want to pivot to you just because you have a very interesting relationship here at a very young age. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, what was it that connected you and Keith? And he charged you with something pretty big to do.
I think for me, it was curiosity. I'm from Spanish Harlem, East Harlem in New York. Two Puerto Rican parents, and that where I grew up it's very, I don't know, it's kind of a bubble. And when I met Keith, he exposed me to things that I did not know existed. I didn't know you could be a living famous artist. My New York City public school education, limited my knowledge or understanding of artists to, like, maybe, I don't know, Norman Rockwell and Picasso. Maybe those are the only two that jump out. So he just, my curiosity and also his interest in teaching. He wanted to teach me about art and wanted to teach me about life. And I think that's what the connection really was about. I think he wanted somebody to tell these truths to, right? He knew he was sick. He didn't know how much time he had. And he wanted, to really enjoy his life and create and check the boxes, so to speak, right? He had all these projects in mind and he wanted to do them all. And he knew he couldn't, but he did as many as he could. And I was there to witness a lot of it. And when I was there, it was just everyday life. It just was what it was. And as I've gotten, 30 plus years away from it, I'm like, oh my God, I was friends with Keith Haring, this icon. So yes, he was, a dear friend, but also an icon.
And I believe that was it in 1987 or 88 that the conversation of the foundation began?
He started talking about a foundation in 1989.
Okay, so that was
with me anyway.
Yeah.
He may have discussed it with others. He discussed that with me in 1989 and asked me if I would be interested in being part of a foundation that he was creating. And I think my first question was, what's a foundation? And he explained that it was a way for us, the people that he chose, myself, Kristen, his best friend Kermit at the time. It was a way for us to sort of carry out his wishes, to continue his work, to continue his philanthropy, to continue to spread the gospel of Keith Haring, and that's essentially what we do.
It's beautiful. And Kristen, you of all people knew him so well, and you shared with us some interesting stories of Keith in his younger days. Tell us a little bit about what he was like before he went out into the world, and what was he inspired by?
I was born when Keith was 12, and my sisters were 10 and 8 years old. And Keith really was at a point where he was starting to make a break from the family in the way that any adolescent does. And he later explained to me and to others that was why he really connected with me as an infant, because I didn't have the judgment of him that my sisters might, because they knew what he was getting up to in school or out of school, as the case may be. And what Gil talks about in terms of Keith wanting to teach, that was just in him from the time he was a child himself. So he very deliberately was trying to teach me to read widely. He took me to the library in my stroller, and teaching me how to think and how to clean paintbrushes very gently, and on and on. The lessons from him were constant and not always welcomed as a little girl. But when you ask who he was amazingly consistent in that way of always wanting to teach, of always wanting to share, of always putting on events. He would host little parties for the neighborhood kids in the yard and do strange projects with them. And he was always, always drawing. This is not something that he got the bug to do only when he was in high school or college. He was drawing from the time he was very young. My father used to draw with Keith to entertain him. And my father did that with all of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And one in each generation has picked this up. I have a great nephew now who his parents, he's about 4, his parents find him awake at midnight drawing. They're not sure what to do with this kid, but also realize that it has the potential to become interesting, so they're letting it go. But Keith was always an artist, and he was also always clear that his time on this earth was limited in a way that it sounded kind of creepy when he was talking as a teenager about not having much time. Long before AIDS, long before he knew what would take him, he had a sense that time was limited. And I think that was part of the fury behind his drawing, of making work of all types. He wanted to be famous, but he wanted to make things that would last, and to communicate with as many people as he could.
And, as he evolved as an artist, music, obviously, a huge influence. Could you speak to, Kristen, Gil, Sarah, what are those other influences that we may not really know about? And what are those other things that really inspired Keith's approach to his work, or what he chose as far as his imagery?
Well, I'll say something about religion, which I think when people see the Christian imagery in Keith's work, I think they sometimes regard it as insincere. Keith was probably, yeah, definitely the most religious of anyone in my immediate family. He went through a period of being what he called a Jesus freak and putting these stickers with the crosses on everything in the house and all of his notebooks. That passed, but he was more than spiritual. He was he had questions about religious organizations, but he very much was a sincere believer, and where you know, the paintings he did of the Ten Commandments, for instance, the paintings where you see angels rising, that Christianity was an influence on him in a way that because he also questions it, because he questions, there's a painting about televangelism, for instance, very critical. Because he is critical, I think sometimes people wonder if he was a sincere believer or not, and he really was, I would say, more than anyone in the family.
I think you can see that in the work too, the way that he knows, when he's being subversive, he knows the story first. So there's this, just this way that he's really mastered the material. I would also say the community aspect, which he found in the club scene, is really important, which it relates to music, of course, but it also relates to the collaborative aspects of his practice, which are really important. He was collaborating with other artists, with dancers, with performers, all sorts of people, from Bill T. Jones to Madonna, Grace Jones, all sorts of people. So that's something that really stands out as an extension of his practice. And he made, collaborative works with George Condo, like it goes on and on, yeah.
I think nightlife, especially the clubs, was a big influence. I think Keith regarded the clubs as church. It was church. Rather than, preachers, you had DJs. And the people at the clubs were community. And I think he drew a lot of inspiration from that. It was just really good energy, amazing music that was happening at the time. Keith listened to everything under the sun, from classical to Sade to Public Enemy to, everything. It was nothing that was out of bounds. But nightlife, I would say, was a big sort of common thread and a big influence on him.
So before, and I'm keeping my eye on the time a little bit here, because I do want to let our audience ask some questions, but the one thing that I was struck with in your essay, Sarah, was this idea of, what do we make of Haring's work today? And, many that are online and many that are in the audience today were here in 1989, and we're part of that moment in time. And, if we think and flash forward to say, well, what if Keith was doing that painting right now? What would those 2 hours he spent with the students in '89, what would he share with our students today? What kind of message would he send our students and aspiring artists in our community? And this is for everybody, this question.
Well, I think he'd recognize the urgency now that how so much of this is coming back around, and that gay marriage has entered our lives. I have to say, my husband's here, and he and I were married on the rooftop of ArtCenter, so it was a nice.
Keep it in the family.
Keep it in the family. And I have to say, that was one of the things when I came back, that the Keith Haring mural came back to teach. That was the first thing, and you and I talked about that. First thing to check in with that. But I think that as an institution, for instance, we're dealing with issues around trans identity, around all sorts of turmoil across the board, and I think I'm sure he'd be on to what is central to the conversation right now, because I think, I think both sides of the equation, after gay marriage came, sort of took stock of what's going on and pursued different sides of gender identity and things, and I'm sure he would be there for that. We can't know for sure, but I think it was present in his work before.
I agree with Aaron. I think there's a sort of thing that I would think he would say that the work is just never done. That there's still, it seems that things are changing and they're still the same. But I guess I don't really have much to add beyond that, other than I just think I think he was just so generous with his work, and in a way, it's still speaking to at least to me. I mean, when I went to the show, it didn't feel like it was a time capsule, or that it remained in a specific time. It felt even more relevant now to me. That's it.
I would say that he would want artists to keep producing and make work with substance. I think he wanted to stand, because I remember him talking about symbiotics and the idea of language, and how, like, if we were ever to transcend that, maybe like 200 years, and it's like we can look at iconography, because even like in the like the internet now, like we're here, we all speak English, but like we try to go to like other places, they might have a different language, in a way that we can all kind of look at stuff is through like imagery. So I think that can kind of like be like a new way of like talking, as opposed to this. But I would say, like, yeah, just make work with substance that means something to you, and it might resonate with other people as well.
I think learning and integrity were very important to Keith. I think he cared about history. He cared about who came before him. He was very curious about artists and their methods and their stories. And, I think he had a great respect for the artists that came before him, and he wanted to learn about them. But at a certain point, it always amazes me, how someone gets to the point where they're in school and they're learning and in a learning environment, and then decide, okay, this place cannot teach me anymore. I have to go out into the world and do that. So it takes a lot of belief in yourself to do that. And I'm not encouraging that, by the way. I'm not encouraging it, but what I am encouraging is like Keith, it's important to learn the history, learn who came before you, and then take that and then go forward and break the rules in your own way.
I would pick up a little on what Danny said. I think Keith would tell all artists and designers that they have the power to move society, and to use that power with heart and with intention. Do the work for the right reasons and keep doing it.
Yeah, I think you're all spot on. I think he would probably say, take yourself seriously. Like you said, Kristen, you have all of the power. Be generous and show up for your community.
Excellent profile of Keith and his impact. And yeah, I think, Patrick, you said the relevance is now more than ever. I feel the same way. What an honor we have to have this mural here to remind us of all of those ideals in what we do. So with that, we have a couple of microphones here, and I invite any of you who has a question for our amazing panel here to come up to one of the microphones and ask a question.
Don't be shy.
Or even share a perspective that you may have had, especially for those that were here in '89. You're more than welcome to share that story.
I have a question. The work that Keith was doing, the subways with chalk, it seems very ephemeral and transient. I also heard you talking about him wanting to create things that stayed and had lasting power. Could you speak a little bit more about those two impulses that he seems to have had?
So very briefly in the video that was shown, Keith alluded to making things that would remain when he was traveling. The murals are very much about permanence. So he would be traveling to do an exhibition, and he himself and the works would only be in that location temporarily, and he wanted to make something that would last through time and last on public view in a place. So that's kind of the story of the murals, and really of the sculpture as well, which is huge pieces of steel that is not going anywhere anytime soon. Those things are permanent. The subway drawings were a very different project. The black paper on which the drawings were made was put up when an advertisement had run its course. No one was paying for it anymore, and instead of taking the advertisement down, they pasted this very soft construction paper up on top of it with a lot of paste so that the advertiser couldn't take down the black paper and have their ad up anymore. And drawing on that with chalk was obviously a beautiful design intervention with the white on the black, but it was playing with the fact that chalk is delicate and ephemeral. So it's two very different projects. The subway drawings, the individual drawings often did not last long. You know, the subway authority was trying to find someone to rent that ad space again, and so as soon as they could, it would be covered over with an advertisement. Just different projects, both about getting work onto public view, but one for a lot of viewers for a short time, one for permanence over time.
Can I just say that there's something so poignant about the chalk on the paper, and I think it has something to do with this idea that marginalized folks, and I think at the time, in that era, he probably felt that way, even as he's embraced in the club scene and everything else, but this idea that people occupying whatever space they can and finding space to evidence themselves, and just knowing what would transpire and what was hitting the community, the fact that this could be removed with a wipe of a hand, I think it's like its form and its form, image, and concept, like so bound together. It's something very profound about it.
I mean, kind of, I think Sarah was saying this earlier. I agree with Aaron that I think it is a powerful message about taking up space and making spaces, but at the same time, it was play. It was playful, and it was. I think that's one thing that I love about Keith is that he can do both of those things at once, and I just think of him as profoundly cohesive. You know, like when you're talking about his integrity, about his sincerity in Christian iconography in his message. It's steadfast, it's playful, but it is with intention.
You know, one of the curious things about the subway drawings from a New Yorker, right, is that it took somebody that did not come from New York to see that space and occupy that space. New Yorkers had been walking by those black spaces for 100 years before anybody thought to draw on them. And I know for a fact that once Keith's drawings started just, occupying the subway, I'm sure there were a million artists that were like, why didn't I think of that? It was there all along. And also, it had to do with like his spirit of generosity. It was really about, folks that were not necessarily going to galleries, not going to museums. It was a way for them to be exposed to art, albeit however briefly. It was his sort of gift to the city.
And also community building. In the same way he would create, street parties in our neighborhood or find a community in the club scene, he used the drawings also to find community in the subway in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is just a simple thing that almost, I think every year there were Happy New Year cards essentially written on the subway panels, that he would do these Christmas cards or New Year's cards, nativity scenes, sometimes things around Valentine's Day, these messages directly to the subway riders. But the other thing that started happening was that he made buttons with, the first ones just had a image of a baby on, the radiant baby on them, and he had his pockets filled with these buttons. You'd hear him jingling as he'd walk down with these pockets full of these buttons. And because people often wanted to talk to him when he was making the subway drawings, and he would produce a button and give it to them. Or even people who weren't talking to him were just standing around curiously like, what are you doing? And he gave these away. And people, some of them who liked the work, some of them just didn't know what this was, would put it on their clothes. And I've heard so many stories from people who were living in New York at that time who said, okay, first of all, the reminder, people in the subways in the 80s, especially in New York, were not chit-chatting with each other. But when you saw someone else who had one of these buttons, there were conversations that started. How did you get yours? Did you get it from that skinny guy who was always drawing with chalk? They weren't even sure they were coming from the same place, and people were trading them. And Keith really loved this whole community that was developing around the button trading, so to the point that he made dozens of images on these buttons in different colors. It was, then it was collect all 20 or whatever. But creating community was part of that project too, and persistence. That there are more than 10,000 unique subway drawings that were made, because we have 10,000 images, so we know it's more than that. In 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's the key. Is he was working on them from 1980 to 1985. And so again, he was, 1980, he was showing, but he wasn't, he hadn't come into any fame. It wasn't until 1982 that he had, started to kind of surface on the international scene, had his first big solo show in New York that really put him on the map. And he continued the project for 3 years after that. And he only stopped it because they were being stolen as quickly as he was making them. And so he said they were no longer serving the purpose that he had intended them for, which was to reach the public in the subways. So I think that's also very important. They were meant only for that space. They were not meant to be taken. So you'll see, if you come to see the show at the Broad, we have them represented by photographs that were taken by Sang-Kwang Chi, the photographer, who worked closely with Keith, and he really thought of those photographs as the way that work would live on, as documentation of the project, and really seeing that work in situ. That's where it was meant to be.
I think we have another question here.
Not a question, but more of a comment. My wife now, but dating at the time, we're visiting a friend of ours in New York. This was in 1987. And we were already Haring fans. We owned the swatches and everything, but we were honored to meet him at the pop shop. And he was just so open and friendly and speaking to art for everybody. Even while he was selling in the galleries, he sold artwork in his pop shop. And we bought a maybe 6x6 canvas, limited, I think there's 15 or 20. We spent $250 at the pop shop and didn't want to tell our parents.
Thank you for sharing that.
And the pop shop comes out of that same impulse, right? To be able to make the work accessible and make the imagery reach as many people as possible.
And do we have a question over here?
Yeah, I have a question. It's circling back to the idea of, street art is obviously now a thing, and it wasn't then. But just it kind of relates to the topic of, taking a place and making it yours, which street art has that role, and ephemerality, which these are settled conversations more or less. But my question is, at the time, say Basquiat, Haring, were they having these conversations about it's supposed to be ephemeral, it's this tug of war? Was it this overt kind of like, we know what's happening here, or was it just, we're gonna go make art, they're gonna paint over it, we're gonna do it again, et cetera, et cetera? I just want to know if those topics were salient then the way they became, say, 10 years later, once people realized, okay, wait a minute, there's real art being put on walls all over the world now.
Yeah, I think Keith was very aware of those topics, very self-aware. He hated that the subway drawings were being stolen. He knew that they were ephemeral. To him, murals were ephemeral. He didn't expect them to last very long. Some of them have very luckily endured, and we can still enjoy them. But yes, he was having those thoughts about the permanence or lack thereof of the work.
I have a question about another mural, the one in Manhattan at the LGBT Center in the men's room. And I just wonder, I know it's controversial and it's been adapted into another type of space than it was originally intended for, but can you speak about that?
Sure. Yeah, he made that work in 1989, and it depicts, it's really graphic depictions of gay sex, of an orgy. And I find that to be such a political statement at that time, toward the end of his life, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, to put forward that kind of work and to make it for the gay community at the center. I find it to be one of the most powerful things I've experienced going into that space.
And it is true that the space is being used in a different way, but I think in a way that makes the space more available. It was originally made in the men's bathroom at the center, and it became they turned it into a meeting room. So it's now a more public space. The center has been a wonderful caretaker of the mural and has made sure that people continue to understand it in the context in which it was made, and the way that it's a celebration of sexuality at the same time that it's a painful reminder of the AIDS crisis.
And you can still tell that it was a bathroom.
Yeah, there's still a urinal there.
There's like tile and drains and things.
And we have time for one more question. And Tito, I could have given you a microphone. You hobbled all the way up to this, so happy to have you at the mic.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Tito. I have many memories being in front of the mural, sleeping on the couch, seeing Pamela Blackwell, one of my favorite instructors, for the very last time before she passed away. Just like a lot of memories. And I loved Haring, but that's just a little thing. So do you think that there could be an artist now like Keith Haring, because art seems to be going into this very commercialized, trite area, you know, like Banksy coming to mind, where it's very like flat, in my opinion. And you know, all of y'all have a lot of power, you know, especially, you know, the foundation. What do you think you all could do to help young artists emerge like Keith Haring, survive in this very difficult modern art world?
I would say like have most of all like integrity. Like if you're not true to like the work that you're saying and you're just chasing trends, I think people are going to perceive you as that. And if that's the case, then you're like the work that you're making is not going to have substance, because you're going to kind of be perceived as a person who's just chasing trends. But if it's authentically you, then no one can really knock you for being yourself. And I think, you know, like if time being, because no one really knows who's going to stand out in a thing. Like you could be hot this year, and then 10 years from now, like nobody is going to remember that time, but you. But I think what really stands out, or at least when I've studied like art, it's like the people who did it generally for themselves, or just for the love of just making work. And I think those are the artists that tend to last the longest, or at least the artists that I've admired, and the artists that they keep kind of like pushing that legacy forward. So I think integrity and be authentically yourself, because who knows you better than yourself?
I mean, I think there are examples of artists that have something to say. You know, there's so many more variables now than there were when Keith was with us. There was no internet, no cell phones, no social media, right? We have all those things now, and those are variables that add or take away, depending on how you look at it, an artist's ability to spread their message. As long as they have integrity, I think that is what lasts. You know, I admire, you know, I admire JR, you know, who I think he has something to say, and I think there are artists that will continue to use their art not only for self-serving purposes, but to do good for their fellow man. And I think in terms of what the foundation, the Haring Foundation, can do to help artists, I think our job is to spread the gospel of Keith Haring and show that example to artists. It's certainly a model that they can follow using today's variables that didn't exist then.
First of all, when you mentioned sleeping in the couch in front of the mural, that's the first story that came to mind. Walking by, students would sleep on it, and they'd have a little note pinned to them saying, "If I'm not up by 1, please wake me up," which is just really funny. But to answer your question, I think absolutely there can be more artists like Keith, and I just want to reiterate that it is about integrity and intention. And as far as what I can do at the LA Times or other capacities is allow people to tell their own stories and make space for people whose stories need to be told and help to elevate that.
Yeah, I think technology, for what it's worth, there's a weird thing that's come about through technology, and it's intimacy of all things. And I think there's the intimacy of being able to connect very directly with an audience, and the idea that we, for instance, hiring an illustrator, like who's talking, like that wasn't a consideration. Do you know what I mean? It used to be like, oh, we're going to hire an illustrator to tell the story, and now it's like we can reach across the world because we can reach across the world with technology. So let's get the right person to tell the story in that context. And I think artists have more agency on their own to reach directly, and then the rest of the world can catch up. Because if you're connecting with people one-on-one, they will tell the story, and the community that I think he was ahead of his time. This idea of high and low. Do you know what I mean? Like like the big picture, and then the moment, right? And the highfalutin museum and the pop shop. Do you know what I mean? And the conversation, right? So, and I think we grumble about wherever we are, but technology I think can do that. I think we can say, and people can find us. So I think that's what artists can do for themselves, and create that community internationally, instantaneously. So. Yeah.
Well, did you want to say anything, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, I think Keith's work, he wasn't afraid to do commercial projects, which I think, in his practice, he was certainly making works that were, massive scale paintings with really complex compositions, and then also finding ways for his imagery to reach a totally different audience than that specific kind of imagery. And so I think that's something that today a lot of artists would look at and think, well, I don't know, that's something that is so much more common today, to be able to kind of straddle both a kind of commercial space and have a visual arts practice. But I think, yeah, some of that kind of way of thinking was quite pioneering in his work. Yeah.
So thank you for everyone for joining in this amazing hour or so that we've had together. Please join me in giving appreciation to the stories that were told tonight. Continue to learn more and more about Keith, and it's something we will always treasure, and this will always be part of ArtCenter College of Design. So we always welcome you back. So just a little couple points of notes for our community here. In celebration of Pride Month, our library, which is right upstairs across from the amazing mural, currently has a book display of LGBTQ+ materials in its display case. Plus, the library will make available for checkout the 19 books that we have on Keith Haring. And if you have friends who would like to visit the Keith Haring ArtCenter Mural, they are welcome to visit between 9 and 6 p.m. when classes are in session. We're offering guided tours now of Keith Haring's mural at noon on the fourth Saturday of each month from June to August. So that would be 24th of June, the 22nd of July, and the 26th of August. And this will be posted on our website as well. And you can contact our exhibitions program at ArtCenter. We are excited to now have a chance to gather out in front of the auditorium here for a reception, continue to have conversations and celebrate the amazing life and work of Keith Haring. So again, thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate it.